In this lecture I want to talk a bit more and in a little bit more depth about the question of migration from the Pacific Islands that may be related to climate change. This is a discussion that's very popular and in the world's media. It's a conversation and a discourse that goes on that's really about the Pacific Islands. It's people who don't live there talking about these places on the basis of what they assume to be vulnerability and what they assume to be the social response. And if we think about this a bit more critically as we will today, and we try and understand how this might look from the perspective of people who live in the Pacific Islands, we get some slightly different perspectives. And I'm going to use today the example of Tuvalu, where we did a small piece of research on this question. And this is the main wharf in Tuvalu. This is one of the ferries that goes between the 9 islands. So there's very popular discourse around the world. The world's media loves this question of the fact that climate change may force people to move from the Pacific. And we get headlines like this about vanishing worlds, metaphors about drowning and sinking and being washed away, and very pithy things like Tuvalu, Tuvalu, which is, from the point of view of people who might live in Tuvalu, a rather dismissive kind of headline to see on the front page of somebody else's newspaper. But it's not just the media that reports this. Certainly in Australia, we have a conversation that comes and goes amongst senior public servants about this question. One senior Australian public servant once explained that it would be far more appealing for Australian policy to relocate people from the small islands, because that would be cheaper than reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. Another has said, and this is a quote, this is a leading economist in Australia, the South Pacific countries will end up having their populations relocated to Australia or New Zealand, and the rest of the world expects that in the end we're likely to accommodate that. So there's a solution. This is from a country where the Indigenous population was forcibly moved around on the point of colonisation and had enormous and disastrous social impacts. This assumes, as economists sometimes like to think, that people are somewhat like railway carriages and we can just shunt them from one place to another, and that's the most efficient solution to our logistical problem. Of course, people who live in the Pacific Islands don't like being talked about this way, and they don't see the problem in such black and white and efficient terms. I'm just going to show you some pictures of Tuvalu here to get a sense that this is a place where people live. There's a rich social life in Tuvalu. People engage in sporting events like this. This is Kili Kili, and you'll have teams of 20 to 30 people playing each other, and it lasts all day, and it's fun, and people enjoy these kinds of things. All sorts of sports and team-based sports going on, a rich social life. An environment to which people belong. People have been living in Tuvalu for thousands of years. They bury their ancestors there, and with the burying of the ancestors is signifying that this is a place to which they belong. It's their homeland. Their cultures and identities are tied up with the island. They have particular and unique adaptations and cultural preferences. This is palaka, this is swamp taro, and the islands of Tuvalu have no natural soil, and so when they were first settled, and it's an incredible adaptation, people began mulching leaf litter, particularly from coconut trees, to create humus in the soil. They brought these plants with them on their canoes. They planted these plants. They take up to 10 years to harvest. They grow them down into the water table. It's a symbolically very important food source for them and a remarkable adaptation to the environment. It's unique and it's particular to this place and to this culture. They have all sorts of trees and food and fruit crops that are important to them, that are particular to that place, that are particular to their diets, and which make people in Tuvalu who they are. And it's a lovely place, for the most part. Beautiful island in the middle of the Pacific, lovely sunsets in the evening. When the sun goes down, everybody comes out and walks around and says hello and talks to each other. It's a meaningful, valuable life. And surely the people who live in Tuvalu and surely the people who live in the Pacific Islands have a right to that meaningful life. And surely the solution can't simply be, well, we'll just move them because it's cheaper than reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And surely we need to be thinking a little bit more carefully about the solution to this problem. This is an impact of climate change, a devastating impact of climate change if people have no choice but to live on our islands. I think it behoves everybody who produces emissions, and it behoves everybody who thinks they might care about these places to think a little bit more carefully about this problem and not just assume the answer is to move them. And if you ask people in Tuvalu, which we did, they say, for the most part, they'd rather not leave Tuvalu. But they want to live in Tuvalu because it's a lifestyle that they enjoy, it's the culture that gives meaning to their lives, and it's a place that gives them identity. It's good here, it's my paradise. God created this place so we could live here. And if we left, we would be leaving part of our identity behind. And this is true for most people who are forcibly migrated around the world. It has significant impacts on their livelihoods and significant impacts on their psychosocial condition. People in Tuvalu know this. This is where we belong, this is where we want to live. And they feel a profound attachment to Tuvalu. People belong to places. Their cultures and their identities are rooted in places and in the people that live there. It's what makes their lives meaningful. It's what makes people who they are. But some people in Tuvalu say they would never leave no matter what happens. Some people say they'd rather die than leave. You can't make another Tuvalu. And the policy people say, well, if we bring up this question of environmental refugees, in some way it means we're giving up the fight. If we say, okay, inevitably we have to leave, then what the people in Tuvalu would be saying is, don't worry about reducing emissions, don't worry about adaptation, we'll just go. And so for many years now, the government of Tuvalu has not been saying that they wish to leave their islands. For many years now, they've been saying, we want to stay, we want the international community to reduce their emissions, and we want the international community to assist us to adapt so that we can stay in our islands, be who we are, and live the meaningful lives that we have a right to live. So, a fairly short discussion here. People should have the choice to migrate. Migration should be a basic freedom and an opportunity that's available to people, and people in Tuvalu do have difficulty moving for reasons of cost and visas and so on. And certainly freeing up the mobility of people from Tuvalu, allowing them to leave and seek work elsewhere if they want to, is a good idea. But they shouldn't be forced to leave. They should have the choice of staying or leaving. They should have the choice of leaving for short periods of time or for long periods of time, to come and to go. But they should have the right to stay if they want to stay. Discussions about moving people to avoid the impacts of climate change is effectively a discussion about precipitating the impact of climate change. If people don't want to leave, they don't want to be forced to leave by climate change policies, nor do they want to be forced to leave by the impacts of climate change as well. So forced migration to people in Tuvalu is considered to be an impact of climate change, not an adaptation. It's not a solution, it's a problem. So the solution here is really quite simple. Emissions need to be reduced globally to enable these islands to continue to exist. If emissions are slowed sufficiently and there's a sufficient effort at facilitating adaptation in Tuvalu, then people can continue to live meaningful lives in their homelands for as long as possible. I'll return to this question in the last lecture of this week.